Welcome to the China in the World podcast, a series of discussions examining China's foreign policy and shifting engagement with the world. The China in the World podcast is brought to you by Carnegie China and hosted by me, Paul Hanley.
Welcome, everyone, to the third panel of the Carnegie Global Dialogue series for 2022 and 2023. My name is Paul Hanley. I'm the director of Carnegie China, and I'm glad to be joined today by Dr. Li-Ming Zhang, Alexander Gabuev, and Huang-Ti Ha to discuss China-Russia relations 1 year into the war in Ukraine. For those who are not familiar with the Carnegie Global Dialogue series, this is our 11th year of hosting the series. It is a series of panel discussions that look at China's evolving foreign policy and international role from the perspective of Carnegie scholars and experts from across the globe and at each of the locations of our global centers. And you'll be able to find replays of the dialogues that we've had previously and today's on the Carnegie China in the World podcast site. So turning to today's discussion, let me introduce each of our speakers. Dr. Li-Ming Zhang is with us tonight. He is an associate professor and provost chair in international relations at Rajaratnam School of International Studies, otherwise known as RSIS, here in Singapore. Ming Zhang's main research areas include Chinese foreign policy, Chinese economic statecraft, Sino-US relations, and Chinese politics. He's the author of a number of books, 15 books. He was author, editor, and co-editor, including New Dynamics in U.S.-China Relations, Contending for the Asia-Pacific, and Mao's China and the Sino-Soviet Split, Ideological Dilemma in 2012. Dr. Li also serves as a member of the editorial board for the East Asia Policy Journal and the Journal of Defense Management. Alexander Gabuev has been with the Carnegie Endowment for some time now. He is now the incoming director for the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center. Alex is a frequent participant in our Carnegie Global Dialogue series. We're glad to have him back again for our discussion this year. His research centers on Russian foreign policy with particular focus on the impact of the war in Ukraine and China-Russia relations. Since joining Carnegie in 2015, Alex has contributed commentary and analysis to a wide range of publications. You've probably read him in the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal or The Economist, among many others. And last but not least is Ms. Huang-Ti Ha, Senior Fellow and the Co-Coordinator of the Regional Strategic and Political Studies Program at the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies, ICS, the Yusof Ishak Institute. Her research interests include major power relations in Southeast Asia and political security issues within ASEAN. Prior to her current position, Ms. Huang was a lead researcher of political security at the ASEAN Studies Center of ICS. She joined the ASEAN Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Vietnam in 2004, and then moved on to work at the ASEAN Secretariat for 9 years, with her last post being the Assistant Director, Head of the Political Cooperation Division. And if you're interested in hearing more of Huang-Ti Ha's perspectives, she recently joined the China in the World podcast, and I'd encourage everyone to listen to that episode. It was a terrific discussion. Before we kick off, and let me just say to our speakers, thank you very much for joining our discussion tonight. And I know our audience is very much looking forward to hearing your perspectives and your insights. Before we kick off our discussion, let me just go through a couple of housekeeping items. First, we will give the audience an opportunity to ask our guests questions during the discussion tonight. We've already got one question in from Santiago, Chile. So please, if you want to submit a question, please use the chat function on YouTube. Second, we'll be posting a recording of this discussion as an episode on our China in the World podcast site. And again, you'll be able to find this one and all the previous ones if you go to the China in the World podcast. It's on all major podcast streaming platforms. So with that, let's kick things off. Our topic for tonight's discussion is China-Russia relations, 1 year into the war in Ukraine. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been a watershed moment in international politics for a variety of reasons. It has sparked the largest land war in Europe since World War II, and it has led to a severing of economic ties between Russia and the West. We've seen new members in NATO, Sweden and Finland. We've seen exacerbating global inflation. The war has also created major disruptions around energy, food security. And of course, for the purposes of our discussion tonight, it has highlighted in new ways the greater strategic alignment between China and Russia that we've been witnessing, culminating, of course, in the announcement by Presidents Xi and President Putin of a no-limit strategic partnership less than 3 weeks before Russia's military invasion of Ukraine. Bilateral trade between Beijing and Moscow is actually on the rise. Trade hit a record 190 billion last year. Chinese and Russian diplomats maintain frequent contact. Earlier this month, we saw Vice Foreign Minister Ma Zhaoshu visited Russia, and on his way to the Munich Security Conference, Wang Yi is also expected to travel to Russia next week. And there's some speculation that we may see a visit to Moscow by President Xi Jinping this spring. Bilateral military exercises continue between the two countries. They've conducted strategic bomber drills over the Sea of Japan. They've held their annual Vostok exercises. Nonetheless, Chinese diplomats continue to express rhetorical support for territorial integrity in Ukraine, and they argue that China takes a neutral position to the war in Ukraine. And so to unpack all of this for us tonight, we have three terrific experts. And I will start with a question for each of you. And I'm going to start with Alex to respond. But just want to kick off with a high-level framing question. And that is, how do you assess today the China-Russia partnership 1 year into the Ukraine war? Is the China-Russia strategic partnership, is it stronger today? Is it weaker today? Is it the same as before? And let me turn it over to Alex to kick us off for our discussion.
I think that the partnership is the same, and the trend line is the same. It's getting thicker and bigger, and it's getting increasingly asymmetric, with China having more leverage and getting seniority and more options in this relationship rather than Russia. It's a mutually beneficial relationship where China benefits somewhat more than Russia, but Russia benefits as well. And that's a relationship that will not be an alliance, but will be an increasingly close coordination and increasingly on Beijing's terms.
Terrific, Alex. That's a terrific, concise answer to frame things up. Bigger, but asymmetric. And that asymmetric dimension is something to watch going forward. Let me turn, if I could, to Li Mingjiang at this point. What's your assessment 1 year into the war of the strategic partnership between China and Russia?
I tend to agree with Alex. I think it's more or less the same. I look at the political relationship, leadership interactions, and some of the common convergent views on important global issues. And you look at economic ties and others, including like social cultural exchanges. I don't see any weakening in this relationship. And certainly, this whole issue of the war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, was not something that's really in the relationship between China and Russia. It was not something that Russia did to undermine Chinese interest, to challenge directly China's interest. I will also agree with Alex that, perhaps from the Chinese perspective, they have tried their best. They have done their maximum to not to be perceived by Moscow as having betrayed the strategic partnership. So it's more or less the same, although we know that there's a lot of debate, a lot of internal discussions in China among people in the wider policy community. There are grievances, certainly. There are all these calculations of costs and benefits. But by and large, I think it's the fundamentals of China-Russia partnership have not been negatively affected.
Thank you, Mingjang. I do want to ask you a follow-on. I just want to press you a little bit on this notion that the invasion of Ukraine is not something that has undermined China's interests. And you will recall last year at this time, after the invasion, there was a lot of speculation as to what President Xi knew in terms of President Putin's plans. Of course, they met just less than 3 weeks before at the Chinese Olympics. And it seems to be that, it's hard to know what the two leaders discussed, but most, I think, would believe that President Xi did not know that Putin would conduct a full-scale invasion, that he would go for Kiev, the capital. Potentially, he thought that it would be limited to the southeast area of Ukraine. There's reports that the 6,000 Chinese citizens in Ukraine were not warned or cautioned that there would be a full-scale invasion. It has also put a spotlight on the China-Russia relationship internationally, and in ways that have led countries in Asia and in Europe to worry that potentially Taiwan is really at risk now because of the strategic partnership, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And what does that mean for Taiwan? Do you see it that way? I mean, are there reputational, when you say it hasn't undermined China's interests, in those ways, would you say that China's interests are undermined? Or how do you look at that question?
That's a fabulous question. You look at the larger global strategic perspective, there are certainly costs for China, losses for China, and some of the losses are perhaps quite significant, including China's relations with the United States, China's relations with Western European countries, EU countries, and now this growth of negative perceptions of China among elites and even ordinary people in many Western countries. And these sort of costs, could be long term, certainly. But the Chinese analysts will say that there are also benefits. Right? You end up having a situation in which the U.S. will have to now deal with really two potential enemies or challengers, and that will help divert at least a bit of American attention and resources from the Asia Pacific region. There could be a negative consequence for the Taiwan issue as well. The whole Taiwan issue has become more international. We're seeing a lot more political, even economic support from Western countries for Taiwan. But that makes mainland China and Beijing's any plan for the Taiwan issue a bit more difficult. But what I was trying to say is that these costs have not really impacted the fundamental aspects of the relations between China and Russia. You do see grievances, you do see negative sort of attitudes in the Chinese policy community, and we've seen actually a bit of effort made by Chinese officials themselves trying to appear a bit of distance from Russia as a posture. But fundamentally, I think the relationship remains robust.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Huang Tiha, what is your sense 1 year into this? You sit here in Southeast Asia with me in Singapore, as you look at the China-Russia partnership, strategic partnership 1 year into the Ukraine war, do you agree with Minjiang and Alex that it's potentially stronger, growing asymmetric, as Minjiang said, certainly not weakening?
Yes, thanks, Paul. I think it is hard not to disagree with what Alex and Minjiang mentioned, because you mentioned the economic figures and all the bilateral political and defense exchanges, and all point to the fact that the relations are getting closer. And I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the chain reaction in its aftermath really added to the momentum, to the structural drivers that had brought the two countries closer together in the first place, namely their shared apprehensions against the West and also their economic complementarities. So the structural factors have been consolidated, and also the bromance between President Xi and President Putin is a big factor behind the closer relationship between the two countries. And over the past year, both leaders have really tightened their grip on power. And that means that, they make sure that the entire society and the state toe their line in furthering the relationship. And there is very little tolerance of different standpoints. Yeah, I think authoritarian leaders tend to double down rather than change course.
Great. Thank you for that, Huang Tia. I'll continue with you and then turn to Minjiang and Alex. There have been some, you've basically said very similarly, I think fundamental aspects of the China-Russia partnership, remain the same, maybe even stronger. You mentioned the bromance, the strong personal ties between President Xi and President Putin, sharing caviar and celebrating birthdays together, having, I think, a lot of things in common in terms of governance issues related to their own countries, and frankly, also how they see the world in terms of geopolitics and international political order, and their frustration with the role of the United States in the broader West. But we have seen some things this year, and I want to ask you about those, that have indicated some misalignment, tensions, not entirely clear. But if you go back to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in the fall, and before President Xi met with President Putin, of course, that was President Xi's first meeting that he had coming out of COVID after 3 years of isolation. I think that's fairly significant. I think that sends a signal that the China-Russia relationship is still important today. But it was interesting that before the meeting started, President Putin said that he was looking forward to addressing some of President Xi's questions and concerns over the war in Ukraine. And a lot of analysts were trying to figure out what was going on there. And then during the meeting in Beijing with the German Chancellor, Scholz, late last year, it did not go unnoticed when President Xi expressed China's opposition to the use of nuclear weapons. And that, of course, was a statement that was viewed as a warning, in a sense, to President Putin at a time where there was growing concern that President Putin may consider using tactical nuclear weapons in the context of the Ukraine conflict. And so, what are these things that we're seeing? Are they indications of some repositioning by China in terms of its stance on the Ukraine war? Are they not that significant in your mind? What do they mean? And do they indicate China's stance is shifting in some way?
You asking me?
Yes, I'll go to you, if that's okay. And I'll turn to...
I think China's approach to the war in Ukraine and how to deal with the relationships with other players related to the war, I think the approach is not like in binary terms, either or, right? So it being more, getting more closer to having a closer relationship with Russia doesn't mean that being stuck with Russia. And China wants to have its own freedom and flexibility to position itself in different ways on the world developments. so that it can speak different languages with different types of audience. And it's also in the interest of China in the relationship with that particular audience. For example, when he met Biden, he said that nuclear blackmail is not acceptable, which is actually in China's interest as well. And when he was at the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the membership of which included Central Asian countries, and of course, being Russian neighbors, they are very concerned about that violation of the UN Charter and the invasion of a sovereign state. So Xi Jinping, I think the rhetoric of supporting territorial dispute and sovereignty is just, a very fit narrative for these countries. And of course, when he met Putin, he says that he wanted to join, Russia wants to join Russia and other progressive forces against hegemony and power politics. So that is the freedom and the flexibility that China reserves for itself in responding to the different dimensions of the war.
Got it. Thank you very much. Minjiang, I want to turn to you on this as well. But I do want to, note in an article that you wrote recently in the South China Morning Post, you wrote that while China remains committed to the Sino-Russia partnership, recent diplomatic efforts show it's also concerned about protecting its global image. And so, how is that impacting, in your view, if at all, China's stance with regard to the war in Ukraine? I think you're on mute.
Yeah.
There you go.
I think there are a number of things that Chinese leaders and their senior officials may regret now. I think in retrospect, they may have realized that they could have handled China-Russia relationship and the war much better from the very beginning. Remember, immediately after Putin's visit to China to attend the Winter Olympic, there was a lot of rhetoric in China saying that the partnership between China and Russia would be no limit, right? No limit cooperation, no limit in terms of scope of cooperation, etc. That rhetoric went very high and created a lot of international attention, especially from many Western countries, and who were very suspicious of such rhetoric. And then that put China on a quite awkward position when Putin launched the war. And then I guess you look at the fact that Mr. Lou Yucheng, right? Many of you probably know the name. He was front runner for foreign minister position. But the fact that he was moved out of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, apparently a demotion in terms of bureaucratic ranking. I think it's a clear sign that the top leaders were unhappy about all these rhetorical hypes during those weeks. Another thing I think Chinese officials may now regret is inadequate effort to try to make China's position on the war itself clearer, right? Now we know in terms of the triggers of the war, origins of the war, China pretty much started with Russia, the official explanation. And on the war itself, you see quite ambiguous statements coming out of Chinese leaders and their spokespeople. So I think there's a sense that, Beijing could have been at least slightly more critical of the war itself, the invasion itself. And that'd be another one. And a third issue that I think some Chinese officials may, in retrospect, feel that they could have done better would be, this public diplomacy. how you engage with media, Western social political elites, and research community in many countries, right? In the minds of a lot of people, China's position, China's response has been pretty much like supporting Russia, siding with Russia. So I think people in China may have realized that they could have done better to make it clear that China was not really supporting Russia. There are some differences, and also in terms of actual diplomatic actions, China could have learned from what India did, for instance, right? India, in the month after the invasion, was trying to be neutral, but it did do certain things to be critical of Russia and also to engage with Ukraine. So yeah, in that regard, in this regards, I think things could have been done better.
Thank you for that. Before I turn to Alex, you mentioned Ukraine, and I have a question that came in from Ian Chung, who's a non-resident scholar with Carnegie China and at the National University of Singapore. He asks, and I'll ask you about this, Mingjiang, the 2013 PRC Ukraine Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, which within the treaty says that a PRC is committed to Ukrainian security and sovereignty, including a guarantee of assistance in the wake of a nuclear threat. Ian asks, where does this treaty stand now, and what does it mean about PRC international commitments, especially Articles 4 and 6?
If I am not mistaken, it's a statement rather than a treaty, but I may be wrong. I need to double check. And the articles, the statements in these documents are a little bit ambiguous. It's not a black and white Chinese commitment to protect Ukraine if Ukraine is threatened or attacked militarily by another country. So you have this bit of ambiguity there. And certainly, I think a lot of people, especially people in Ukraine, will regard this as China not honoring its commitment, whatever is formal, informal, or legal, or whatever. So you have this sort of feeling, and also even some people in China will question this. People who are against Russia's war in Ukraine will say, China said this and that to the Ukrainians, and now there's no really direct diplomatic political support to Ukraine. So it's an issue. Perhaps also to add to the list of Chinese regrets, that would be something that I think Chinese officials should not have really made that sort of commitment to Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I got a note from my staff, who I guess doing some fact checking. It was a treaty signed by Xi Jinping and Viktor Yanukovych before the annexation of Crimea, parts of eastern Ukraine. Let me turn now to Alex and get your views on some of the things that I mentioned we've seen over at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and then the statement that President Xi and the Chinese side made during the German Chancellor's visit. Do you see any indication of shifting on China's part, specifically with regard to the war in Ukraine?
3 very quick points. Let's zoom out and see where China's interests are with regard to the war. It has a partnership with Russia that is important. Russia is a large neighbor to the north. Having a stable, peaceful border with Russia is quintessential for China. If Russia turns into a pro-US democracy, applies to NATO, that's a strategic nightmare for China. So keeping the Russian foreign policy as it is, probably less hostile, less aggressive, but definitely neutral or China-friendly, is a benefit. Accessing Russian natural resources, particularly at a discount, is also very beneficial. And then finally, it's a like-minded authoritarian regime on the UN Security Council among the 5 permanent members. It's really Russia and China are the authoritarian camp, whereas the US, UK, and France are the other camp. So having Russia as a like-minded partner on this UNP5 is really quintessential, since both Xi Jinping's and Vladimir Putin's worldview is very much informed by skepticism, let's put it that way, towards the US and intentions to dismantle the Russian regime or to undercut China's rightful rise as a global superpower. So that's first. Russia is important. And at the same time, China perfectly understands that relationship with the West is of paramount importance. It's a downside road given the trend line in the US-China competition, but the precious resource that you have as a Chinese policymaker is time. So you need to do what our colleague Evan Feigenbaum calls Beijing straddle. So you need to triangulate between this needs to appear as a country that respects international law, your pragmatic interest with Russia, and the fear that appearance of being close to Putin disrupts your relationship with the West even further. That's point one. Point two, let's do counterfactual. Imagine that China throws Vladimir Putin under the bus, introduces sanctions, and kind of says that the barbaric imperial onslaught against Ukraine is absolutely unacceptable, and China joins hands with all of the civilized members of the international community. So if that leads to Putin's downfall, the question in China is, will that help that China would provide fundamentally improve US-China relationship? And the answer is no. The expectation is, and I think that's the right expectation, that the West will just pocket this concession and say, okay, China, what about Xinjiang now? What about Taiwan? What about IP theft? What about the PLA spending? What about human rights in Hong Kong? So the deeper fundamental drivers for US-China rivalry will not disappear. Support for Putin is just one problem, but that's not the fundamental problem. So it doesn't matter how much you kind of throw Vladimir Putin under the bus. This is why you need to kind of figure out this way that helps you to not worsen the relationship with the West beyond repair, but at the same time, keep your friend Vladimir Putin afloat. And then my third point is that I think that China has adopted a template it used after 2014 annexation of Crimea, and actually after Russia's recognition of Abkhazia in South Ossetia in 2008. China sticks to the letter of international law, like no annexation is recognized. China all the time says that it respects Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. It says that conflict resolution should be through peaceful means, and then it doesn't support war. But at the same time, it says we don't like unilateral sanctions. And it was supportive of the Russian narrative that, oh, expansion of the US-led alliances is the root cause of evil. And of course, it talks about NATO, but what it means is AUKUS and the US intensifying ties with other partners in the Pacific to check China's rise. I think that China noted that this rhetoric is ill-received, not only in DC, but in Europe. And that's where China started to fine-tune and adjust both the domestic propaganda and also the outreach to foreign capitals. So Fu Cong, the ambassador to the EU, is doing a very smart charm offensive, talking to reporters and saying that, oh, but we didn't know anything about it, and this is how much we are not with that guy. So I think that all of the phrases of Xi Jinping in the Scholz readout, in Biden readout after meeting with Xi in Bali, points to this direction, is how China wants to portray its stance, but not necessarily where the real stance is.
And just to clarify, you have seen shifts in the way China's state media is reporting the conflict in Ukraine, as well as its propaganda domestically?
I think I'm basing my assessment of what my friend and great colleague Maria Repnikova in Georgia State does. And I think that her conclusion is that there is some shift and there is a more balanced coverage to a degree, because China figured out that its propaganda travels outside of China's border, and there are a lot of skilled China watchers that can explain to Western policymakers on how China portrays this war. So the coverage gets somewhat more mutual, and then the society is toward, but not that deeply interested in what's going on there.
Thank you, Alex. Terrific responses. I'm going to go back in reverse order. I'm going to go back to Mingjiang again. And just want a couple of things that Alex has just said. Number one, the relationship with Russia strategically is important for the security of the two, the shared border between the two. He mentioned doesn't help China to have a hostile nation of Russia, to its on its border, and so it's better to have more friendly relations. And of course, there's a number of issues, like-minded issues, UN Security Council, and other places where they can help each other. And also, Alex mentioned Putin's downfall won't help China's relationship at all with the United States. But what I want to ask is about to what degree, how do you believe the Chinese leadership looks at the conflict in Ukraine right now? How important for President Xi himself, and this comes from a question from Evan Medeiros, former senior director in the Obama administration on Asia. How important is it for President Xi that President Putin doesn't lose the war in Ukraine? Is that an important goal for him? And what would President Xi be willing to do to prevent Russia from losing?
Well, if Russia completely loses, there's very little, almost nothing that China can have to save Russia. And I would say China probably doesn't have any strong incentive to help prevent such a scenario of Russia being completely defeated or Putin losing badly. One reason is this: if China would go out, do its best to save Putin and Russia, and it will basically lead to almost complete collapse in the relations between China and the U.S., China, and in the Western world, EU countries. And that's a huge consequence for China. I don't think Xi Jinping or Chinese are prepared to accept that kind of consequence, right? So to me, that's difficult to imagine. And I think more likely China will continue its wait and see and wait and see policy and watch the situation in Ukraine closely. Even if Putin or Russia is defeated militarily and Russia becomes a much weaker power, and that will be something acceptable, I think, for Xi Jinping and for China. Instead of going out to help Russia and save Russia to prevent Russia from being defeated. I think that's more likely. And there is a sort of thinking in the policy community in China that no matter what, Russia has so many resources. It has a very large population, has a large territory, and even it's badly defeated, it won't become a small power. Right? It will remain at least a middle power for quite some time. And this defeat, even if Putin is gone, although we don't know whether that's going to happen or not, right, will leave a deep scar in the minds of a lot of Russian elites. It's hard to imagine that in post-war era, if Russia is defeated, you will see Russia completely tilting towards the West, join the U.S. to do things against China.
Thank you for that. I want to turn to Huang Keha and get your sense. Do you agree with that? I mean, do you believe that the Chinese side would be willing to sort of let, if the Russians lose, that's something that they can live with? Or do you believe that it's very important on the Chinese side that they do something to try to help Russia and prevent Russia, President Putin, from losing? Is that an important goal to the Chinese leadership?
I share Ming Jiang's views that, I think China is not going to extraordinary lengths to keep Putin and Russia from losing the war if that is the trend or the momentum, because the cost of, going to such great lengths to help Russia and whether it would be of any help or not, I'm not so sure as well. It would be immense, because it is not only about the collapse of the relationship with Russia, with the US and the West, but also the reputational cost of China in the global South as well. Although many of developing countries, they have ambivalent views about the war in Ukraine, but it doesn't mean that they agree to the invasion of a sovereign state. And it's a huge strategic cost for China, because they are trying to win over Europe from the US, and then doing so would make China completely isolated from the West. I think is even irreversible cost. So I think the ultimate pragmatism of China's foreign policy would dictate that China would not have such a direct critical stakes in the war in Ukraine that it have to do so for Russia.
Thank you for that. Alex, I'm going to turn to you on this particular issue and dig a little deeper here, because, of course, you remember last year, despite the frustration, I think, from the United States and countries in Europe about Beijing's straddle, as Evan Feigenbaum referred to it, where it maintains that strategic partnership with Russia, does not criticize Russia for the war, blames it on NATO, but yet tries not to damage China's relations too much with the United States or Europe. Despite the disappointment, I think, in Washington, D.C., or the frustration that position may have caused, there were really two things that the administration pressed the Chinese on, and that is to say, there will be consequences if China undermines the international economic sanctions that have been levied against Russia from President Putin. And there would be consequences if China provides military armament or equipment to Russia in the context of the war in Ukraine. There have been reports about now several Chinese companies have been sanctioned by US authorities for providing Russia with dual-use technology, like semiconductors and drones and telecommunications equipment. New reports suggest Chinese state-owned defense companies are shipping navigation equipment, jamming technology, jet fighter parts to sanction Russian government-owned defense companies. And you hear concerns in Washington about potential slippage in this area, that this could be an area where China may slip a little bit and begin to think, based on this question of how important it is that President Putin and Russia not lose in Ukraine, that maybe we'll see new information emerge in this area. And of course, when you combine that with the recent visit by the vice foreign minister to Russia, the two foreign ministers meeting, and the fact that President Xi may travel there, if any new information comes out, of course, this would put real pressure and real tensions in the U.S.-China relationship. What's your sense, Alex? These recent revelations, in your view, they indicate some slippage here on the Chinese side? Are we beginning to see changes regarding China's potential sanctions evasion and military support for Russia?
So, two quick points. First, on the bigger issue, I think that we need to define what defeat here means. Russia is still a nuclear power. I think that we are not off the hook, unfortunately, of Russia potentially using nuclear weapons if Vladimir Putin believes that his regime, his legacy, his personal survival is under threat on the battlefields in Ukraine. And then it's just very easy to say that, somewhere in Putin's brain, there is a magic line that tells him, here is Russia proper, and here is Ukraine, and that you chopped off Crimea illegally in 2014. And this is why if Ukraine retakes it, it doesn't constitute any major challenge to the territorial sovereignty of Russia. It's a big risk. We don't know the answer. I think that all the evidence points to the fact that Mr. Putin believes that having Crimea inside Russia has really near sacral meaning for his legitimacy and legacy. And then he won't stop short of any option to keep Ukraine retaking Crimea from happening. So dealing with a nuclear superpower is hard. So complete defeat, meaning that Russia pays reparations, returned all of Ukrainian internationally recognized territory, and Mr. Putin and his friends and all of the people who looted, raped, and killed in Bucha and Irpin travel to Hague is very unlikely. And I think that China knows that very well. So keeping the stalemate, China doesn't need to do any extra effort. What China does, and here I'm coming to your question, is to continue everything what's outside of the scope of the sanctions as a normal practice. It's not illegal to buy Russian oil. And then India does it, Malaysia does it, many countries do it. It's not illegal to do a lot of stuff, and everything what's legal is done by China. It's done through RMB mostly, and it's done using the logistics that's provided by cross-border. When it comes to certain shipments that were reported recently by Wall Street Journal, if you look carefully, these are execution of old contracts that predate this war. And these are mostly between the Chinese sanctioned entities like Polytechnology Group and the Russian sanctioned entities. They are both SDN for quite a long time. That putting them on the entity list predates the war. So it's a Chinese sanctioned entity, military industrial giant, trading with a Russian sanctioned entity, most likely in RMB, most likely on train against the border. It's very hard for me to imagine what the US can do about this. Like slap new sanctions on the intermediaries, it's like cutting Hydra's heads. They will grow somewhere else. And the question for the US policymakers is really, okay, do we design a special sanctions program targeting other parts of the Chinese economy because of that? And we have this hammer and say, China, if you don't stop this activity, we will hit you with this hammer. Problem is that Beijing views, for example, the recent Biden's executive orders on October, which kind of puts very significant export control limits on chips and AI and various other cutting edge technology, and say, hey, you are doing this anyway, and you are doing this to us because we are China, not because like some company sends a jamming equipment or part of jamming equipment to Russia. So this is happening regardless, and it's very unlikely to me that China will stop this trade, although it's pretty small scale and limited.
Thank you for that, Alex. Mingjang, let me turn to you on this question. The Wall Street Journal reports that Alex referred to about these Chinese state-owned defense companies. And as Alex says, these are likely Chinese sanctioned entities selling equipment to Russian sanctioned entities. And it's hard for the US potentially to do anything about it. But nevertheless, I suspect that these sort of sales would have to receive the political approval by the senior leaders in the Chinese Communist Party. And there's a political signal, of course, that is sent. You've mentioned, that part of the leadership's goal in China would be to try to preserve as much as possible its relationship with the US and the EU and not to damage it more than is required. These kind of moves, of course, even if they're sanctioned entities, of course, would have a political impact on the US-China relationship and China's relationship with Europe as well. So back to the original question, do you see slippage here? And if so, what political impact will that have?
Well, a couple of things can be said. I think, first of all, now it's been 1 year since the war broke out. And as we know, Chinese government, Chinese companies have been very cautious. China's major shipping companies, for instance, have intentionally tried to avoid getting involved. They have basically refused to ship Russian oil. And Chinese banks have made it very clear that they will not get involved in these currency transactions with the Russian entities. And I've been asked by some Chinese business people as well. They always ask the question, if I sell some machineries to Russia and the Russian counterparts use those machineries to produce military armaments, is that a violation of the U.S. and European sanctions on Russia? So what I'm trying to say here is Chinese corporate entities are very cautious. I think they have learned a very big lesson from case of Huawei and Zhongxin, and certainly, second point, there will always be loopholes. There will be some small companies, or like what Alex just shared, some of those Chinese companies that had already been sanctioned would take the risk and to make some quick money, right? No matter what. So you will see these loopholes, these sort of activities. But overall, I think so far, a lot of evidence suggests that China at the official level does not really want to get involved and does not want to be accused of supporting Russia through providing all these things, navigation or parts that could be used for weaponries.
I agree with you, Mingjiang. I think it's been surprising to many. I think there was a view that maybe China would try to operate in the gray zone where it was ambiguous. They would do steps to try to help Russia's economy, or they may provide dual use or equipment that's more ambiguous to Russia that they could then use somehow in the context of their war. But China has not done that. China has sort of stepped away from the gray zone and has not done anything that would be ambiguous in nature. And what Alex is suggesting in that these Chinese sanctions entities may, and as you just said, they may go forward with some things. But just for clarity's sake, doesn't that still have to get the senior level of approval in an issue that is so particularly sensitive geopolitically? Wouldn't these companies, even if they're sanctioned, have to seek approval from the Chinese leadership to be able to move forward on those kind of sales?
It's quite possible that they will need at least some sort of consent, or at least there should be no objection, I think. But what complicates our discussion is, as Alex mentioned, those transactions were contracts that had been signed before the war. So I don't know whether Chinese officials will say no, okay, no matter what, even if it's a deal that was reached before the war, scrap it. Don't go ahead and stop the transaction. I'm not sure whether the Chinese official will go that far.
Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to look a little bit forward. And I'm going to start here with Huang Tihua. China stresses that it is in favor of a peaceful solution to the war in Ukraine. Rhetorically, we see China support that. We've not yet seen China, proactively step up in any mediating role or proactive efforts to de-escalate the conflict. And this, I think, generally tracks with China's approach to foreign conflicts, where, rhetorically, it will stress its neutrality, but often, or its support for finding diplomatic solutions, but yet hasn't yet stepped up to take a more active role. I want to explore and start with you, Huang Tihua, whether you see any pathway to a ceasefire or negotiated settlement in Ukraine here in the near term, And if so, what tangible role could China play, will China play in trying to de-escalate the conflict? How realistic is that?
The first question about if I see any pathway to a ceasefire or negotiated settlement of Ukraine, I don't see any pathway yet. It's completely unknown, I think, to all of us. And with regard to China's role in somehow it can play in de-escalating the conflict and how realistic it is, I think that those are exactly the same questions that the Chinese leaders and policymakers have mulled over since the war broke out. Not without the prodding of some European leaders recently. And I think so far they have been quite reluctant to proactively take this role or search for this role or assert this role. Is a clear answer that China is unwilling to do so. I think the first questions that China would ask is what it will get out of this mediation role. Probably is enhanced international standing and credentials as a peacemaker, right? But they are too vague to be worth the effort of trying and the risk of failing, I think. And will the US and Europe reward China for doing so by watering down their strategic competition with Beijing? I think China is very clear-eyed that it is quite magical thinking. And also equally important questions are whether China has any significant influence over the protagonists, the warring parties, and the chance of its success. I also think that China is very realistic about its limited influence over Moscow with regard to the trajectory of its warfare in Ukraine. And I think more fundamentally, China particularly doesn't feel the overriding imperative and the urgency of de-escalating the conflict because it does have conflicted interests in this war. And for all the complications and the negative implication that the war has presented to the Chinese economy or foreign relations with other countries, I still quite buy into this argument that the war in Ukraine really presents a net geopolitical win for China.
Thank you, Tiha. Alexander, I'm going to turn to you on this question. Do you see a role here for China in de-escalating the conflict? How real, and if so, how realistic is it that Chinese leaders would agree to that kind of role?
I fully agree with Tiha. First, we don't have any demonstrated experience of China mediating conflicts, even in its immediate neighborhood, where it would have tremendous leverage. Look at Myanmar, for example, or North Korea, which you, Paul, know much better than any of us, since you've dealt with the issue working in the US government. China basically has provided logistics for the six-party talks and was involved, but that didn't lead to any breakthrough because of the North Korean regime. But it's not that China has really thrown all of its weight to fix the issue. So with the parties involved, I think that China is very skeptical and realistic about it. And then when it comes to its influence over Vladimir Putin, indeed, the leverage grows and that China has a lot of cards to play, but it understands how focused Putin is on this war in Ukraine, how important the whole thing is for him. What he did is very irrational for most of the Chinese policymakers. This is why when the US presented China with evidence of what Russia is about to do, of course, not sharing sensitive sources and methods of the US intelligence community or how the US knew what Putin is about to do, we know that China has shared this information with Moscow and said that the Americans are trying to drive a wedge between us. So now they understand how emotionally focused Putin is on this. Will China's oil embargo change his mind? Very unlikely. And then the definition I hear, and that's my last point, sometimes from the Chinese colleagues, is like Russian foreign policy is like a typhoon. So you cannot really control it. You can hedge your bets and hide. And then when on the margins there is strong wind, you can put some wind farms and produce electricity. So use it to your benefit. But the hope that you can really control the typhoon is crazy, and we are not the loonies party.
Thank you very much. Mingjiang, you're going to get the last word of the evening. Do you agree with Tiha, Alexander? Do you have anything additional that you want to add?
Overall, I think I would agree. It's very unlikely that China will become proactive in terms of mediating or play any role between Russia and Ukraine. But I think the Chinese are probably waiting for a moment when both Russia and Ukraine and perhaps Western countries have stronger interest to come to some sort of like a ceasefire or negotiated settlement. And then at that point, China may become a bit more active in terms of, proposing suggestions, even offering a role in a multilateral setting to join France, Germany, or other European countries, and then as a group to mediate and try to facilitate a final settlement.
Thank you very much. It's been a terrific discussion. Let me thank Huang Tiha from ICS here in Singapore, Dr. Li Mingjiang from RSIS in Singapore, and Alexander Gabuev from Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. Thank you for joining us for the Carnegie China Global Dialogue series this year to discuss China-Russia, and we look forward to having you back. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you for listening to the China and the World podcast. For more episodes and research, please go to carnegieendowment.org. This episode was produced by Nathaniel Schur with assistance from Caijing Yuan and Mike Tiernan. The music was composed by Spencer Barnett.